it's now my even greater privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. Now, my colleagues have said that actually our keynote speaker hardly needs an introduction because he's a household name, or more, they said a classroom name. Not a household name, but a classroom name. For most English teachers around the world. He's a well-known ELT author and trainer, and every time colleagues have been talking to me about Jeremy, they say he's a guru, he's a guru, he's an ELT guru. So I was saying to our ambassadors, we've got Jeremy, an ELT guru, who's coming to the conference. He's inspired countless teachers through his seminars and his trainings and his publications. He's worked all around the world. He was telling some of us his amazing stories last night. And through his plenary, which we're going to have now, on how not to teach answers, Jeremy will share his insights on an important aspect of classroom practice. And for some of you later on today, he'll also be singing and teaching you all around songs and music in Shakespeare with his guitar, so that'll be amazing. So, I will stop, because it's now time to get a much more important person on the stage, and I'd like to welcome and thank Jeremy. Jeremy.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Listen, this is really exciting for me. I arrived for the first time in my life in Ukraine on Wednesday evening, and I had the most wonderful, action-packed day yesterday, thanks to the British Council, Simon and Natalia and everyone. Thank you so much for the welcome you've given me, and more important, for making it possible for me to visit this amazing country. What a fantastic. And much more than that, I'm phenomenally pleased and proud and honoured to be speaking at the 24th IATEFL convention. Just to give you some idea of my own background, the first IATEFL conference I ever went to was in the city of Oxford in the United Kingdom in 1977. My IATEFL membership number is 67, which is kind of shows that it's amazing I'm still standing up, really. And it's also an enormous honour, by the way, for me to be speaking at a conference which also has as one of its speakers the past president of the international IATEFL, Marjorie Rosenberg, who has been, I don't know where she is, are you here, Marjorie? Obviously, if you're here, you may not be here at this particular moment, but she was our president for IATEFL UK, and it's a massive privilege to be here with her. Because for me, IATEFL has been my international family for as long as I've been in the profession, and to speak at IATEFL Ukraine, wow. Congratulations on the work you, Svetlana, and everyone in IATEFL does. Congratulations. You talk about confident teachers. This is about making teachers confident, about making teachers forward-looking, about making teachers, what shall we say, speedboats. And in case you have no idea what that means, I will explain it later on. To be a teacher of English in 2019, and Simon, you spoke about this, is to be much more than a teacher of English. You spoke about this. It's to be something else entirely. Or, rather, to be a teacher of English, but more. And in my rather long teaching lifetime, I'm faced with an existential problem, a personal existential problem, which was with me when I very first started teaching in about 1923, and has been with me ever since. And to explain what it's all about, and to explain what this talk is all about, I'd like to introduce you to this movie. Have you seen this movie? Yeah. Hands up if you've seen it. So quite a lot of us, but quite a lot of you haven't. In case you haven't, this movie is an American movie which tells a story that I did not know about before, and most people didn't know. That's why it's called Hidden. And it tells the story that the American space program, and yes, I know the American space program, the Soviet space program, always in conflict, and who's going to be number one, and blah, 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 blah. But whether it was the Soviet Union or America or anybody else, the great and extraordinary achievements of those days, the 1960s, were inspiring for anyone who was around. Now, it turned out that one of the reasons the Americans were able to send men into space and into the moon was because of women of colour in the National Aeronautical Space Agency. They were called computers. Why? Because they were all mathematicians, and they did the mathematical calculations that allowed the Americans to have confidence that they could send men into space, but much more importantly, bring them back again. Now, there were people in Ukraine, in Russia, in the whole of the Russian Empire, who were doing the same thing, the Soviet Empire, whatever you want to call it, doing the same thing. But I never knew before that there were women, and this is the point. Remember the United States in the 1960s? This seat was for white people, and this seat was for black people. So even in that environment, they had this gang of women who helped to make the American space program possible. And they were mathematicians. So this is a very clever title, the movie, because it says hidden figures, because the figures, the women, were hidden because nobody knew about them in those days. And of course it's also very clever because it's about figures like mathematical figures, calculations. So on your screen you'll see the three actors who played three characters. Now on the left was an American woman, a woman of colour, who became the first ever woman, amazing, but not just woman, but woman of colour who was allowed to qualify and train as a space engineer. Nobody else had ever done it. In those days they didn't expect women to be engineers in America. Maybe in this part of the world, much more enlightened, of course. But over there, they didn't expect it. And she was a woman of colour. On the right of the picture is the actor who's playing the part of the first woman of colour to be a team supervisor at the National Aeronautical Space Agency. But the woman who interests me most, and who is, if you like, the central character in the movie, is the woman in the middle. And it turns out that in real life her name was, and is, Katherine Johnson. And Katherine Johnson was a gifted mathematician from an early age. A genius, a Mozart of mathematics, if you like. And the movie, which of course is not quite the whole truth, it tells lovely stories. There's a whole very funny joke about toilets in the movie, which probably wasn't really true, but it's great in the movie. It turns out that Katherine Johnson, and this is true, Katherine Johnson was the person who persuaded the first man to go into space. He says in the movie, and this is documented, "I will not go unless Katherine Johnson says it's okay." And all the men were saying, "Don't be ridiculous." No, he said, "This woman, if she tells me that mathematics are good, I will go. But if she says that mathematics are not good, forget it." And what were the mathematics? Nothing. They called them computers. But the computers in those days were primitive old things. What did she work out? She worked out exactly how to get the spacecraft back. And if you get it back the wrong way, what happens? It burns into toast, and that's the end of the spaceman and this or woman, and it's the end of the spacecraft. But Katherine Johnson, she worked out mathematically how to do it. She was amazing. What a woman. Katherine Johnson is still alive. She's about 99 now. This is the real Katherine Johnson. There she is, being presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor by Barack Obama. Oh, Oh, come back, please come back. Oh, no, that's not you. It's not my country accent. Well, now, I don't know what happens to you in your professional life and your personal life, but if you go and see a movie about something that interests you, what do you do after you've seen the movie? What do you do?
A lesson.
Read about it. How do you read about it?
Google?
You Google it. That's it. It's you Google it. And I just thought, wow, this woman sounds really interesting. I wonder if the movie was true. It was great fun, but is it true? How much of an exaggeration is it? So I went and Googled Katherine Johnson and found out a lot about her. And I found out, for example, that here she is still alive and kicking. Well, not kicking so much, but hey, but certainly still alive. And I went searching around. And I found a TV program in which she was being interviewed when she was a young woman of just 95. And this is what happens to us as teachers and educators, because everything you see or hear becomes part of our professional world and our life. So I'm going to play you a little bit of the interview I found. It's going to be a bit primitive. I'll have to use the microphone for our sound system, but hey. And let's see, and by the way, don't panic if you find her a little difficult to plug into, because when you hear someone's voice for the first time, sometimes it's difficult. Don't worry, because we'll just have a listen to this. Now, so she's being interviewed on this program about her life as one of the most famous American mathematicians. But in the course of the interview, as you'll see, the interviewer says to her, now, I know you have some strong views about education. What do you think? And she starts talking about her daughter, who has just retired as a teacher. And they start talking about teaching. This is what she says. Let us pray.
I never have taught answers. I teach you what the problem is, how to attack it. If you attack it properly, you will get the answer.
Which is, in some respects, we've had this conversation about standards of learning tests and the sort of the teaching to the test and the big concerns that teachers have about this.
Well, the attitude of my daughter, who was one of them who was teaching rest, said that they taught only to the test. She said, so there's a lot of material out there that's not being taught because it's not on the test. Well, that's unfair to the student, it's unfair to the teacher that they are being taught that way. So I think it's important that you learn the background of what you're working on and how to do it. And you get the right answer. If you don't get it the first time, you'll get it the second time. But you don't arrive at it by teaching answers.
And that's Katherine Johnson. Now, I said to you that I suffer from an existential crisis. And please don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about my personal life. But it's an existential teaching crisis. So let's have a little look at what she said. There were two things she said that fascinated me. And the first thing was the whole issue of tests. This is exactly what she said about tests. She said, her daughter said that teachers teach only to the test. So there's a lot of material out there that's not being taught because it's not on the test. She speaks American English. Okay, it's okay. That was a joke, but not a very good one. Well, that's unfair to the students. It's unfair to the teachers to just teach for the test. But we have a problem. All my life, I've been a teacher of English, and my students have taken tests. Because it's one way we have of trying to work out if the teaching has been successful, if the learning has been successful. And if you want a place at the university, the rector was talking about all the English medium of instruction, and they were telling us we had the opportunity to visit the rector this morning before the conference, which was wonderful, and we were learning about the masters, the English language masters, the English language doctorates, and so on that they have here. And how do you get onto a program like that? How do you graduate from a program like that? Well, you take a test of some kind, and they're part of the life of teachers and students from the beginning of time. How do you become a doctor of philosophy? How do you become a doctor of letters, a doctor of science? Well, you take a test. But what Catherine Graham is saying is that when the balance between learning and testing goes wrong, we end up focusing exclusively on the test. That's a bit of a problem, because learning isn't about learning just what's in the test. Or is it? But we have, don't we? We have a much more romantic view of learning. My view of learning is that it's about some kind of emotional and spiritual growth, and that it makes us more creative. You have a program called Creative Spark you were telling us about this morning. Creative, what a word creative is. And what we hope our students will do is to be creative, adventurous, confident, if you like, to go out into the world of English, or forget English, the world. But if all we're doing is teaching to the test, well, how do you make confident, creative people there? Unless, of course, you say to me, and you may say this, unless, of course, you say to me, look, you know, the fact that I've just passed the Cambridge proficiency test makes me confident. Well, yes, so you should be. It's an incredibly difficult test. And if you've got it, you're fantastic. And if you haven't got it, you're still fantastic. Please don't worry about it. Because we're teachers of English. We are fantastic. We're the... Okay, stop. Okay. Well, no, really. Some of the introductory remarks. What a job to have to teach English. What are we doing? We are trying to help people communicate better with somebody else. And if we're lucky, and I say this nervously in this part of the world, if we're lucky, we help other people, help to make the world a more peaceful and a better place. And that's a pretty good thing to do for a job, I think. Although when you're teaching can and can't to a group of beginners, it may not seem quite what you're doing at the time. But on the whole, anyways, enough of that. So here's the first existential crisis. What am I doing? Am I here to help you get this qualification? Or am I here to make you a more creative, wonderful human being? And are the two things the same or different? Here's something else that Catherine Johnson told us. Oh, by the way, talking about tests, what do tests test? Well, they test lists of things. Oh, wait a minute, it's not there yet. You probably can't see that, but this is a typical page from a course book from about 1977, maybe 1980 or something. And it looks remarkably like a course book from about 2019. Because what does it say? It's a list of things. Unit 1, what have you got? And it's have got, singular, plural, noun, singular, plural, who, families, have got, singular, plural, possessive S, instructions, base form of the verb, imperatives, you know. Then we've got, where do you live? Oh, now we go to the present simple, only the first and second persons, of course. And then we go on, and then we get the third person, singular S. This is exciting, isn't it? And of course, the point is that exams can test that. Exams can test lists of things. And we make lists of things. We're terribly concerned in English language teaching, or I guess in mathematics teaching or any other kind of teaching, to know where we are. How many do you know? How many on the list do you know? But then in one of the most wonderful, but kind of slightly quirky, ramshackle pieces of creativity, if you like, a number of educators in Europe, this wonderful mixture of idealism and trade and and amity between peoples that my country is... Don't go down that road. Don't talk about Brexit. Okay. But the the Council of Europe looked at these kind of lists and they said, wait a minute, there's something slightly wrong here, because being able to use a language doesn't mean you know 93 of something. That's not what it is. Being able to use language means that you and me can have a conversation about anything we want when your English is good enough. You can tell me how to find the something, or we can talk about films or movies, or we can fall in love, or whatever it is. We can do all these things with a language. And the Council of Europe said, so when you say that you know English because you know 93 structures, that can't be right. So they came up with, what was their answer to this? The Common European Framework of Reference. And the beauty of it, and it is beautiful, but a bit chaotic, and the beauty of it is they said, the way you find out how good your language is to see what you can do in language. Can you do this with language? Yes, you can? Well, then you're that. Can you do this? You can? Well, then you're that. And the original version of the CFR looked a bit like this. So if you're at level A2, I can express simple opinions or requirements in a familiar context. That's in listening. But I can complete forms and write. So what the Council of Europe tried to say is instead of saying, you know the present simple, well done, sir, what it actually says is, you can do this. And the beauty of it, the dream of it, was that you don't need the teacher or an exam to tell you what you can do. All I need to do is to give you this list written in Ukrainian, and you can then say how good you are in English. And you don't need me to tell you. You don't need an exam. You don't need a final test. You don't need a Cambridge exam or any other kind of exam to do it. Isn't that brilliant? The dream of it was to make the knowledge of a language perfect for you. But of course, people then started using it as a new list to examine people by. And all the course books that we published started saying, this book is designed for the Common European Framework level C1 or B2, which kind of destroys the whole point of what this was, which was not to be a list. But there's something we have as human beings which says we have to know how good we are. We have to know exactly how good we are. And the result of that, of course, is the amazing Pearson Global Scale of English, for example. And the Global Scale of English says the Common European Framework is not sufficiently detailed. It's only got 6 levels. And it doesn't have many levels down at the bottom when you're a beginner. So they've got their own new set of levels, and there are, 99 or something? 90 different gradations of knowledge. Now the question, by the way, and this is a list worked on by some of the great academic specialists in their field doing that, what we have to ask is whether that's the kind of list which helps students to learn, or whether we're back in the area of lists. And if you think it's just Pearson doing that, of course it isn't. Everyone's doing it. It's all the rage. This is Cambridge lists of levels. So, existential crisis number 1. I'm a teacher of English. Am I teaching you lists of things, or am I teaching you something more, what did we say, something more warm and cuddly? Here's the second existential crisis, if you like. And this is the other thing that Catherine Johnson said. I have never taught answers. She says, I give you a background, I give you a problem, you work it out, and it's when you work it out that when you work it out, that's when you discover things. And so here's the second great educator's existential crisis. What is your role in the classroom? Is your role to teach people things? Or is your role to create provocations, if you like, to get students to learn things. What's your job? If someone says, what's your job? You say, I'm a teacher. What does that mean? Does teach mean, and you'll find some dictionaries, to stand doing what I'm doing and tell you stuff and then you learn it and then I'm going to test you? Or does it mean something else? Is the job of the teacher to fill, this is the famous old phrase, to fill empty heads with knowledge? Or is it to make you a curious, hungry, thirsty individual who wants to learn? And the reason this is an existential crisis is that everyone in this room is a very special English learner. I'm talking not about us three, for example, the three obvious native speakers I can see here. We didn't thirst and, well, we did, but we didn't have to do that kind of language hunger, because it just sort of happened to us. But for most people who speak English as a second, third or fourth language, and that's about 6 or 7 times as many people in the world as people like us, for most people who speak English as a second language successfully, like you do, B2, C1, C2 level. Well, you didn't learn English because your teacher taught you. You learned English because something your teacher did, or maybe your parents did, or something about you made you thirsty for it. And I dare say that many of you, for some reason, fell in love with the idea of English as a language. That doesn't mean you have to fall in love with England or America, but you fell in love with the language. Just as other people fall in love with music, or if they fall in love with something else. So this dilemma, this existential crisis, what is my job, is not new. Of course it's not new. People have been worrying about this since even before I started teaching. Well, a few thousand years before, to be honest. But the person I want to tell you about is a man called Ivan Illich. Have you ever heard of Ivan Illich? Anybody? Ivan Illich, anybody? What nationality do you think he was? Russian? No, he was Austrian, actually. So, well, I don't know. Nationality, what does it mean? Anyway, but Ivan Illich was a Catholic priest. And he was a radical educationist. And way back in about 1969, he and a group of other educational radicals met in the beautiful city of Cuernavaca in Mexico, the city of eternal spring, it's called. And they met there and they spent a few days getting really excited. And smoke poured out of the chimneys and they got really passionate, and we're going to do this and we're going to change everything. And Ivan Illich wrote a book about that meeting. Do you know what he called it? He called it, listen to the title, he called it De-Schooling Society. De-Schooling Society. And I've read the book. I don't know if I could find it anymore. It's somewhere in my flat, buried under all the other books. But the key quote for me is this. He says, learning is the human activity which least needs manipulation by others. Learning is the human activity which least needs manipulation by others. Most learning, you've got to really listen to this. Well, you don't have to. You can do what you want. You can dream or fall asleep, but I recommend that you listen to this. Most learning is not the result of instruction. Most learning is not the result of instruction. It is rather unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. Most learning is not the result of instruction. Here's the quote. There's the book, and there's the quote. do you feel about that? How does it make you feel? Great? Or nervous? Redundant? How do you feel? The problem about it is that it really unnerves me still. Because I understand exactly what he's saying. You learn because something's happening inside you, not because I'm doing something to you. It's what's happening inside you that makes you learn. And of course it's true that children learn all sorts of things. I was saying just now about us, the native speaker of a language, who we just seem to get the language almost accidentally, it seems. But guess what's happening? We're actually having unhampered participation in a meaningful setting, and we don't get that much instruction. Well, actually, if you look at the way that parents and adults talk to children, there's a lot of construction there, and you were talking about social constructivism, so let's talk about that afterwards. But a lot of what kids do is unhampered participation in a meaningful setting, and then suddenly you're a completely perfect speaker of Ukrainian or Russian or Spanish or whatever language it happens to be. But in a classroom, an awful lot of what we do in a classroom is to teach people the present simple, third person singular S. Or everybody's favourite, the present perfect. Which is your favourite grammar structure to hate? Love. The present perfect. The third conditional, hooray! This idea is not particularly new. I was talking yesterday with a group of teachers about this man called Sugata Mitra. And Sugata Mitra is an Indian scientist, computer scientist. Have you ever heard of him before? Hands up if you know who he is. A few of us. Have you ever heard of the hole in the wall experiment? Hands up. Okay, let me tell you very briefly about this man. This man is Indian, though he now works at the University of Newcastle. And in New Delhi, he put a computer in a wall at the height of children. So the adults, oh no thank you. So this was at the height of children, and he put it, this wasn't in a rich part of New Delhi, this was in just any old part of New Delhi. And he put this computer in the wall in New Delhi, and he left it there. What do you think happened? Yes, straight away. Children rushed up to it, they said, watch this is really exciting. These aren't educated kids. The computer it wasn't in the children's language, the computer, but they started playing with it. They played with it all the time, and pretty soon, they were using it fine. They learned how to use it all by themselves. Most learning is not the result of instruction, said Ivan Illich. And 20, 30 years later, he's proving this with his hole in the wall experiment. The kids started using this computer, playing with it. They downloaded antivirus software. And so Sugata Mitra said, that's the way we should reorganize education. Because schools, can you hear Ivan Illich again? Schools are outdated. Actually, all you need to do is set children a good challenge and let them get on with it. And the beauty of living in, this was 1999, the beauty of living in 1991 is the internet. You can do anything you want. Because like me with Catherine Johnson, what can you do with everything you can? Google it. We know everything is there on Google. So you can say to children, forgive me for those of you who heard me, a few of us yesterday afternoon talking about this, you can say to children, why do men have moustaches and women don't? And all you have to do is put a group of 4 or 5 kids round a computer screen with internet connection and leave them to it. And they'll find out why it is. And probably better than I do. I know it's something to do with testosterone and hormones and all this kind of stuff, but I don't know, but kids will find this out for themselves. If the question is interesting enough, they'll find out for themselves. You could ask children things like, do we have souls? And they'll find out. And his argument is, you don't do this on your mobile phones because these are individual alienating devices. You do it with 4 or 5 kids sitting around a screen, and they find out for themselves. Now, of course, this is highly controversial because another part of what he says is that you don't really need teachers for this. Just let that sink in. You don't need teachers for this. All you need are sympathetic guides. And so he comes up with this theory of what he calls self-organized learning environments, S-O-L-E. What did I say? Self-organized learning environments where people learn on their own. You understand where we're going with it. If you were a Catherine Johnson, Ivan Illich Sugata Mitra kind of person, you would say that teaching the third conditional in the way that it has been taught over the generations isn't quite the way to do it. Because these guys seem to be saying something completely different. A newspaper of choice, although, as you can see from 2 references, for me and I suspect for 1 or 2 other people in this room, is a British newspaper called The Guardian, which actually isn't really a newspaper anymore at all. I haven't read the paper version. But, what did I do when I woke up this morning? I checked The Guardian. And what it said was, is Ukraine ready to elect a comedian as president? But you see, the real problem about foreign journalism, the real problem when newspapers talk about another country, is they only tell you a tiny little bit of the truth. And it took till Wednesday evening to find out that this candidate for the president isn't just a comedian. There's a whole lot more to him. But in Britain, the headline, because it's more exciting, is, am I getting off the point here? I think I'm getting a little bit off the point. Anyway, so I read The Guardian, and this report took my attention. No grades, no timetable. The Berlin school turns teaching upside down. And it tells you, I don't know if you can read this, about Anton Oberländer. And Anton Oberländer went to the German rail network, and he managed to get the German rail network to give him and his colleagues free rail tickets all around the southwest of England for their holidays. And they were so impressed with him that they invited him back to give a talk to the rail network company to show how to do it. And Anton is 14 years old. And what have they done with Anton in school? What have they done at the school? They don't teach him anything. They set him tasks and projects to let him, and they let the kids get on with it themselves to work out how to do it. Now, of course, this is terribly easy. I don't know, this Berlin school probably has children from particular types of families. For all I know, they come from very comfortable socioeconomic backgrounds and so on and so forth. But isn't that incredible? Because most 14-year-olds don't get that opportunity. Most 14-year-olds are taught things. So, my existential crisis. Oh, by the way, somebody I mentioned yesterday in one of my sessions. This is a man called Phil Ball, an Englishman who has lived and worked in the País Vasco for many years. País Vasco? The Basque country, northern Spain. And he and I were on a panel at a conference of Spanish teachers talking about teaching, and the teachers were asking us questions, and we came back, and he said something which was so extraordinary that I wrote it down straight away. And he said, this is what he said. I don't know what you think about it. This is what he said, I said. And his argument, of course, this man believes passionately in CLIL, content and language integrated learning, using content as the main driver of learning. But you could narrow this down and say, if I give you the right kind of task, the right kind of interest and engagement to do something like Anton Oberländer at that school, you will do it. The existential crisis that I've been talking about in such detail, well, it's summed up it was summed up for me in this place. Now, you can't possibly know which place that is, but you might be able to see a flag there. Do you know which national flag that is? It's Mexico. And Mexico's flag is amazing. It's got, in the middle of it, it's got an eagle sitting on a cactus with a snake in its claw. Which, I'm sorry, I mean, the Ukrainian flag is beautiful and it fills me with love and everything, but you don't have an eagle, okay? And you don't have a snake. And some other time I'll tell you why they have an eagle sitting on a cactus with a snake, but that's another story. Okay, now, I took this rather bad photo in November 2018 in my favourite Mexican city, which is a city called Oaxaca, spelled O-A-X-A-C-A. So most Americans call it Oaxaca, but it's Oaxaca is the name of the city. And the thing about Oaxaca is the capital city of the state of Oaxaca, where the teachers are really angry. And why are the teachers angry? Because the state governor, they think, they don't like him. Because they say that he doesn't invest state money in education, that teachers aren't paid properly, that the whole of teaching is a system of patronage, and so on and so forth and so forth. So what do? They occupy the beautiful city centre square, which is one of the most... Normally you can sit there drinking a beer, watching the wonderful women walk past with all the beautiful pottery on their heads and the beautiful indigenous costumes that everyone wears and this beautiful atmosphere. But no, the place is full of tents, a tent city of really angry teachers. And they're there for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then the police turn up and stuff goes wrong. So when I was there in November 2018, the square was full of angry teachers. Mostly asleep, but they were angry asleep. And they had little posters everywhere. They had posters all over, so they'd written up little posters. Hands up if you speak Spanish. Anybody speak Spanish? So you'll understand this. I couldn't resist this, taking a picture of this. I don't know if you can kind of work it out, but el propósito de la educación es mostrar a la gente cómo aprender por sí misma. The whole point of education is to teach people how to learn for themselves. The other way of looking at education is adoctrinamiento, which means, guess what? Indoctrination. And that's the crisis, the existential crisis. The whole point of teaching or education is to help people to learn how to learn for themselves. But the flip side of that coin is indoctrination. So I have to tell you that according to this teacher, every time you teach the third condition, you are indoctrinating your students. But of course the great mystery of teaching is that you have taught your students the third conditional, and guess what? They learn it. So that's why this is such an existential crisis. Now look, very quickly, I'm conscious that I have no idea how long I've been speaking, probably about 3 days actually, but it feels like that to me, and probably to you. But Catherine Johnson started me off on this way of thinking, because I found that interview online. And, you know, why am I here? People create religions to answer that question. Why am I here? What am I here for? Am I here to help you to learn how to learn? Or am I here to indoctrinate you? Of course, there's a flip side. There's another side. And indoctrination is probably a bit strong, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit over the top. It's a bit of an exaggeration, isn't it? This is a picture of my sitting room, a part of my sitting room. As you can see, I rather like guitars, but I haven't got enough yet. Well, come on, you've got quite a lot of shoes. I have guitar. Anyway, so, and the one in the front, that little one, I've got that with me here, which is strong. Anyway, so how do you learn the guitar? Well, you can go to guitar. Hands up if you play the guitar. A few of us, the good people. Sorry. So the rest of you who don't play the guitar, what's the best way to learn the guitar? Just take it and try it. Would you prefer to take it and try it, or find yourself a teacher? Just a little experiment. The thing you can do with guitars is you can tune the strings differently. So a normal tuning for a guitar is E, A, D, G, B, E. Got that? But if you want to get a particularly nice sound, you tune the strings differently into something called DAD-GAD, which obviously means that the strings are tuned to D-A-D, G-A-D. And it gives the guitar a particularly nice sound. And in my Shakespeare show this evening, I'll be starting away in standard tuning, and then I'll change into DAD-GAD. Would you like to learn how to play DAD-GAD? Of course you would. So, you would. Okay, just say you would. Yes, good. Right. Okay, so I'm not going to teach you how to play DAD-GAD because you don't need me. I'm your guitar teacher, but you don't need me because the whole point of education is to teach students how to learn for themselves. And where can you learn how to play the guitar? Google, or specifically YouTube. So I'm going to say we're all here, the people here who don't play the guitar, would you like to learn on YouTube how to play in DAD-GAD? The answer is yes, you would. Here we go. Let's do it. Let's do it. I think, hold on. Oh, come back. Something should happen. But actually nothing's happening. You sort of, look at it, it's sort of going bop, 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 bop. I'll try one more time. Oh yes, here we go.
Okay. So I'll do the inside scale first.
Okay, got it? You can watch that, can't you? You just learn how to play the guitar. It's easy. Or would you prefer a teacher? And it's interesting because in this room, my guess is some people would prefer a teacher. And some people would be happy just to look at that and kind of work it out. She's one of them. So you two are like that. But me, I play the viola. I started playing the viola when I was 43. And I really needed a teacher. And when you look at students in front of the class, you in a classroom, some of them want to be taught how to learn for themselves. I'll rephrase that. Some of them want to be encouraged or facilitated to be able to learn for themselves, but there are other students who are sitting there saying, teach me. Who's right? Zoltan Dornier, the great motivation expert above everything else, he says, of course, we have this sort of parallel existential crisis about explicit and implicit knowledge. In order to learn the language, do you need to understand explicitly how the language works? Or do you just kind of absorb it, a bit like we did as kids? What about if you're learning it when you're 14? Can you just absorb the language and get it? Or do you need explicit knowledge? And this is what Zoltan Dornier says. He says, because it is true, some people just seem to absorb languages. But there aren't many of them in my groups. Many of the students in my groups need more help. They can't just watch a video of someone playing the guitar and say, I can do it. I can try that. They need someone to say, you hold it like this. There are 6 strings. Put your finger here. Or something. Michael Swan. Do you know who Michael Swan is?
Yeah.
Yeah, Practical English Usage. How many people have got a copy of Practical English Usage? Yes, so have I. All editions. It's fantastic. Really good stuff. Michael Swan says, well, you can read it. So we need to make sure you get exposure to the highest, what does he say? the highest priority language forms, which means the present simple, or the third condition, or the something. And he also goes on to say, and this is why it's so difficult talking about English language teaching, he also goes on to say, I think one of the most wise things he's ever said. There are no miracle methods waiting to be discovered. We've been doing this for thousands of years. We're not more intelligent than they were 1,000 years ago. We've had different experiences and we have different contexts, but you know, those men and women were pretty smart too. There isn't a miracle method waiting to be discovered, and when you come across someone from this stage saying, I have a miracle method here, it will change your life, my instant reaction to that is, not so sure about that. There's a guy called Hugh Deller. Have you ever come across Hugh Deller? Yeah, he's been in Ukraine, right? Of course he has. He's been everywhere. And he and Andrew Walkley wrote a book called Teaching English Lexically, which, anyway, but that's for another day. But it's an exciting book and it's full of passion. If you've seen Hugh speak, you'll know that Hugh is also full of passion. Sorry, you've seen Hugh speak. In this book, they worry about our obsession with grammar. Because everyone in this room has been taught grammar to within an inch of their lives. Grammar, grammar, grammar. People in the old education system were taught grammar. People in 2019 in the new education system are taught grammar. And yet the kind of people that I was hearing about yesterday in the state of Tamil Nadu in India sound to me much more like as if they're being treated like Catherine Johnson might suggest. In other words, finding out and experimenting for themselves and plotting their own progress. Kids, little kids, 7, 8-year-olds, that kind of thing. This was reported to me by some members here, and it just sounded really exciting. And much more like Sugata Mitra than like teaching grammar. I'm so confused. This is what Hugh Deller and Andrew Walkley say, and you will recognize the tone of voice immediately. Forget her, because she's just lovely. And forget him, and him. We'll come back to them in a minute, because I've lost my sequence. But this is what Hugh and Andrew say. We spent hours of our lives teaching the same 20 or 30 structures. How on earth do people learn English? Because language is much more than that. Language is much richer, it's more creative, it's more organic and everything else like that. Remember Phil Ball? If you want students to learn English, don't teach language. Maybe what we need to re-examine, everyone in this room, or maybe to experiment with, is ways of getting students to do something else, not just grammar. If you want your students to learn English, don't teach language. Get them to do something else, and the language will come with it, is his cry. And I will go back, this is so unprofessional, but don't tell anybody this happened in my talk, okay? If we go back, let's go back to, I do want to introduce you to this woman. Do you know Sheryl Crow? Hands up if you know Sheryl Crow. Good. Can you tell me any of her songs? Or every day is a winding road, I get a little bit closer. That was so much. Anyway, she's a country and western singer, and if you want to understand anything about life, there is only one place to go, and that is country and western music. Because they know everything, people who write country and western songs. And she was visiting London, and she was sitting in a hotel room eating an apple, and they gave her a little mini interview. And they said to her, "What have you sacrificed for your art? What have you sacrificed for your art?" What do you think her reply was? "My love life. I think whatever you give your attention to is what thrives. Whatever you give your attention to is what thrives." Here's the quote. You can just see it above the flags. And do you know what? I think it's one of the wisest things I've ever heard about teaching and learning. Whatever you give your attention to is what thrives. So my job as a teacher is to get you to give your attention to something. And the whole of the secret of teaching is this easy, except it isn't. The whole of the secret of teaching is trying to work out what to get our students to give their attention to. Because it will thrive, it will grow. If I can get you to actually give your cognitive and emotional attention to something, you will learn, whether you want to or not. So Phil Ball says, if you want your students to learn English, don't teach language. What he's saying is, if I get you to give your attention to something else, which really commands your attention, well then, it will thrive. And if it's full of language, the language will thrive. It's that easy. Except of course, listen. So, we're going to rush past Scott, even though he's a good friend of mine, and say, look, I've got to finish now. To try and make some sense of this kind of wander I've been allowing myself to go on, and you've had to suffer me wandering through this existential crisis of mine. All provoked by a woman who is clearly really, really clever, and quite a character, and a really important figure in her area of life. Because she's not just this great mathematician, she's not just the person, one of the people who made the American space program of those days possible. She's also been a teacher all her life. And I heard her say, this woman who had impressed me so much by watching a Hollywood movie, I heard this woman say, "I don't teach answers." And I translate that to, I don't just teach the third conditional. El propósito de la educación es mostrar al alumno cómo aprender por sí mismo. The whole point of education is to help students to understand how to learn for themselves. And I feel very emotional and warm and cuddly when I say that, but I also think of all these Ukrainian school kids. And they need to pass the tests. And the tests are full of grammar. So what on earth do we do? A few little things, and then I'll finish up with something else. So if not grammar, well, grammar's important. Of course it's important. So is the global scale of English. They're all important, but it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story. Whatever you give your attention to, Sheryl Crow said, is what thrives. So let's think about getting students to give their attention to something else. And my metaphor, it's a story I told. Did I tell this story with you guys yesterday? It's a story about my brother. And my brother, he's younger than me. He's much more good looking, and he's actually much nicer as well, and I hate him. But, so my brother has been a teacher of English for many years, and his expertise is teaching very advanced English. Cambridge proficiency, that's his forte. And he has been renowned as a wonderful teacher of advanced English, and but for reasons of health, which that's for another day, he can't teach at the moment. So he and his now wife went off to southern Spain. They left England and went to southern Spain to get a bit of sunshine during the English winter. Unfortunately, it snowed. But anyway, but that's what they did. And they have a camper van. And I rang him up when he was in Spain, and I said, "Hi, Philip, how are you?" He said, "Fine." I said, "How's your Spanish coming on?" Because he doesn't speak Spanish. He said, "Oh, it's great," he said. He said, "It's fantastic. I found out that if I want a glass of wine, I ask someone how to say, 'Can you give me a glass of wine?' in Spanish. And then I ask for a glass of wine in Spanish, and they give me a glass of wine, and I've learnt it." I said, "Yes. Yeah, and?" And then he realised he just said something really, really silly. He's been a teacher for years. And he'd just come up with this great new insight. And what is the insight? The insight is just so obvious it doesn't bear thinking about. If you need to do something, you'll do it. Whatever you give your attention to is what thrives. And if your attention is obsessed with having a beautiful glass of red wine, you will find a way of getting a beautiful glass of red wine, or whatever it is, or having some maternity advice, or finding out why your car doesn't work, or finding how to get from, I don't know, from Kiev to Odessa. I don't know what it is. Whatever it is, if you need it enough, you will get it. And that links straight back into what Phil Ball was saying. If you want your students to learn English, don't teach language, get them to need something. And if they need it, they will give their attention to it. And if they give their attention to it, it will thrive. Students need to understand the purpose of something. I know that the average Ukrainian teacher understands that education means sitting in classrooms for hours and hours and hours, and the teacher will teach you grammar. But I had a wonderful little role play with some teachers at the British Council Centre yesterday, and one of the role plays, which made me laugh a lot, is they asked me to pretend to teach them, and then they started behaving as they said teenagers behave. So one of them sort of jumped up and said, "I've got to go to the toilet." Another said, "Teacher, can I have a selfie?" And another one started doing, and they were all misbehaving. They were really awful. You give them a job, they're really awful. But of course, so we discussed it. And why does that happen? Because most teenagers are really bored by sitting there being taught grammar. But if you give them the motivation to have a glass of wine, oh no, sorry. If you get them to do something where they can clearly see the purpose of what they're doing, then something else happens, and they're much less likely to get involved in all these distractionary activities. And finally, el propósito de la educación, teaching people how to learn for themselves. The greatest quality that any teacher can ever pass on to their students is this. It's to make them curious, just like little kids are. And again, to talk about what Simon was telling me yesterday about these kids in Tamil Nadu, they're not old enough to not be curious. That's what I heard in this story. Kids are curious. Of course they're curious. That's why young kids absorb information from everything, from what they're told, from what they see, from what they smell, from what they feel. It's magic when you watch little kids doing that. And it's all still here. But life kind of squashes it down. Our job is to make students curious. Now, this is the end of my talk in 2 seconds. But this has all been very kind of, what's the British English expression? Very airy-fairy. Very kind of, bit hippie, man. Bit creative. But the challenge is this. For me as a teacher, for us as teachers, the challenge is to try and understand what someone like Catherine Graham is saying in a world where our students need to pass tests. The challenge is to somehow find ways of giving students purpose, whilst at the same time being sure that they do absorb the wretched third conditional. Because you need to be able to manipulate English grammar if you want to communicate. It's as simple as that. But just teaching it doesn't seem to work. Hugh and Andrew, bless them, I understand what they're talking about. You get to upper intermediate level, Unit 1, the present perfect continuous. Teacher, we've been doing this for 5 years. There's something wrong with that. So what do? Well, I think we experiment. We see if we can take the risk of listening to Phil Ball. We see if we're prepared to take the risk of the glass of wine approach. A metaphor, obviously. We see if we are prepared to spend more of our time provoking curiosity than teaching the present perfect. I suppose the person who most beautifully expressed this in a kind of abstract way was a man who I used to see often around Cambridge in Market Square. I live in the city of Cambridge in England, and you'd see him going around Market Square. I once went to my favourite Indian restaurant in Cambridge. Of course, as you know, Indian food is Britain's national food now. Although it's mostly cooked by Bangladeshis and Pakistanis. But anyway, that's another story. And I was in this restaurant. I was there with my ex-wife and my kids. And suddenly from the back of the restaurant, a voice said, and I think this is a reasonable imitation, "Two of my PhD students spoke to me today and they're worried about their doctoral thesis." Who do you think that was? Very recognisable, although his voice was computer generated. He, of course, was this man. Go away. Oh, I forgot about the speedboats, but you can ask me about speedboats later. He was this man, Stephen Hawking. And when he died, last year, was it last year? When he died last year, his coffin was carried through the streets of Cambridge, and all of the university students lined the street and cheered and applauded as he went past. What an extraordinary man. And one of his most famous quotes seems to me to apply to us. Because teaching is not just about learning how to teach and then doing it for the rest of your life. Teaching is about how to experiment and discover how to do it better, more excitingly, more creatively, more... If we think learners have to grow, so do teachers. To develop, to grow, to be full of existential crises all the time, so that it keeps us going. And this is what Stephen Hawking said. He said, and I think that works pretty well for teaching, really. Be curious. And Stephen Hawking's second commandment was, have a really great high-level conference. Thank you very much for listening.